Thanks, Ceann. Minister, it obviously goes without saying that some restoration of public service pay is undoubtedly better than none. I'd imagine that public sector workers have experienced a certain degree of relief that after 5 years of ye being in office and consistently pilfering large amounts of money out of their pockets, that this year you've thrown a partial amount of that back. But the reality is that what we actually should be discussing here is the abolition of the FEMPI Acts. We shouldn't be having them anymore. The bill may partially restore some elements of pay in the public sector, but the number of hours that public servants are going to have to work is still going to be longer. They'll have fewer holidays and far less conditions than they had before we bailed out the banks. And that's the reality of this bill. In fact, the small pay increases in this bill, which were negotiated as part of the Lansdowne Road Agreement, are even smaller than the headline rates that she flagged up. Now, the TUI, fair play to them, have been incredibly vocal in relation to the bill and the agreement. They've labelled it as unfair, as heavy-handed, and I agree with them. It gives the government the power to withhold about €1,600 for supervision and substitution duties by teachers, due to be paid in 2 tranches starting from September of next year, and it gives the government the power to refuse to pay incremental pay rises either. For members of unions which are seen to have repudiated the Lansdowne Road Agreement. Now, this gun-to-the-head mob movie, union-busting sort of extremism really gives a lie to your own propaganda that you're confident that the Irish people believe the lies that you're peddling about a recovery and your brilliant economic stewardship. If you were so confident, why would you need to have such vicious tactics imposed in the bill? And it's because you've lost the hearts and minds of public sector workers, and you know the only way you can get an agreement on this is by viciously attempting to ram it through. I think the TUI correctly point out that the pay increases from 2016 will have little, if any, impact on part-time workers, the most vulnerable section in the public sector as it is. I'm so annoyed about this that I'm almost sort of struck dumb on it. I mean, we're talking about FEMPI remaining in place till 2016. In other words, you're retaining the right to unilaterally cut public service pay for at least another 3 years. That's in effect what you're saying. And it does make a mockery of this recovery and the ending of the emergency. It actually exposes your own propaganda. And the real agenda here is precisely as Deputy Boyd Barrett pointed out: why waste a good crisis? That's really what this is all about. It's about the race to the bottom. We dress it up as reform, but for neoliberalism that means an all-out assault on the terms and conditions and pay of workers that was fought for over decades by the trade union movement. It's resulted in longer hours, shorter holidays, poorer working conditions, to name but a few. And, you know, precarious and casual labour now is now part and parcel of the public service. We're having job-bridge jobs in the public service. It's an absolute disgrace, and it does stand on its head what was once something which was not an unreasonable expectation for citizens, that we might aspire to the idea of a secure, permanent, pensionable job that would allow us to put a roof over our head for our families, access to health care when we were sick, access to education for our children to achieve their full potential, and so on. But all of these things have been under attack. Now, I don't have time to go into the points, but I do think the casualisation of labour, which obviously once it sets its stall in the public sector is repeated in the private sector, is being entrenched further as part of this bill. I think the TUI again give the information that 1/3 of TUI members at second level and up to half of those under age 35 are either in temporary or part-time employment. How in God's name could they buy a house or rent a house in our economy now in those conditions? University lecturers people who you might think were the kind of elite of academia, many of them on hourly contracts with very, very limited hours. 66% of university staff are now casual workers. We obviously know the figures about the overall shrinking of the public sector itself, with a massive reduction in numbers there. And the consequences of that are in frontline services, in the closure of Garda stations, in people on hospital trolleys, in the biggest class sizes in the Eurozone, even after your so-called reform in that area. Members of the Defence Forces surviving on subsistence and with supplementary payments from family income supplement and so on. And I think we should make a point about two categories of workers in particular. Firstly, women. The public sector was one area where women held their own, where equal pay was more of a chance of getting it in the public sector than you would in the private sector. And not only that, it was an environment that marketed itself on the idea of being family friendly and encouraging women in that regard. In fact, women in the public sector earn 5% more than their private sector counterparts, and at the lower end of the scale, the most vulnerable sections of women, public sector wages for women were 15% higher. This is an attack on that, because what happens in the public sector is followed by the private sector, and we know that many of the family-friendly working arrangements have been stood on their head in the name of austerity, and none of these things will be protected after the passage of this bill. And in that sense, I see it actually as a specific attack on women workers because of their prevalence inside the public sector. The second group of workers who are being particularly targeted are not having their needs addressed are pensioners. It's great that there is some restoration of public state sector pensions. Brilliant, given the butchery that she carried out on the livelihoods of pensioners. And I have to say, you're doing nothing in this legislation to deal with the occupational pension schemes such as the IASS. Now, IASS pensioners will find themselves in exactly the same position after this bill as they did before, despite the fact that these workers spent most decades of their working lives building up pensionable service in a state-owned company. It's a pretty big kick in the teeth, to be honest. I think, you know, for people who are presently on a pension in that scheme, people in their 70s, 80s, 90s, by next week, in October, when the cuts out of their pockets are taken out for October, 5 million will have been robbed from them to pay off a Section 50 debt that they didn't even know that they had. A Section 50 debt which was unilaterally passed over to Aer Lingus and DAA pensioners who had it deducted at source from their monthly income without their agreement, without consultation, without compensation, and without being party to any debt resolution process. A debt, if you like, that they didn't even know that they had. And absolutely no compensation or relief has been provided to those workers who worked in state employment all their life. No recognition for the deferred pensioners either, whose long service leaves them being less off. A long service deferred pensioner with, say, decades of work, 42 years in one instance, experiencing a cutback in their retirement pension of 58%. It's absolutely and utterly disgraceful. And you had an opportunity to use some of the money out of the sale of Aer Lingus to address that shortfall. You have another opportunity with this legislation now. Given that the bill allows for the variation of the amount payable or rate of payment out of money provided by the Oireachtas or the Central Fund or the growing produce of that fund to certain persons for certain services to or on behalf of the state, the Central Fund, being one that the IASS pensioners have paid to date 35 million via the stamp duty pension levy, could this not now be diverted in order to bring back and restore some of the savage cutbacks in their living standards which were imposed on them under the same name of austerity? You've done nothing nearly enough for public sector workers, but you're absolutely ignored pensioners who gave their full working life in this regard. And you are due to face court cases which are going to ensure that you're going to have to foot the bill by trampling on the rights of these people and taking their pensionable retirement from them. So this bill, it isn't even too little too late. We should be discussing the abolition of this repressive emergency legislation, not attempting to pat yourselves on the back that you've thrown a few crumbs back.